Welcome to today's webinar, Compounding Lab Design and Engineering Considerations per USP 800 Guidelines is presented by Bryan, an independent consultant specializing in compounding workflow, lab design, and USP 800 compliance. Bryan has over 15 years of construction management and pharmaceutical containment technology experience. He enjoys sharing best practices on safe chemical handling techniques, lean workflow strategies, and USP-compliant facility design. Bryan has published numerous articles on compounding pharmacy workflow design and has been the invited speaker at conferences on workflow and USP 800 throughout the United States for several compounding-related companies and accreditation organizations. Today's webinar is accredited through ACPE and is worth 1 contact hour. CE credit is applied following completion of an evaluation link found on the last slide in the presentation handout. You can find the handout on the lower portion of the GoToWebinar toolbox under Handouts. We are recording this session and will include the recording and an evaluation link and a follow-up email 1 hour after today's live session. Questions may be submitted throughout the webinar using the GoToWebinar toolbox on the right side of your screen under the Questions tab. We will answer the questions submitted following the presentation. If we do not get to your question today, a list of questions and answers will be emailed to all attendees following the webinar. Thank you for joining today's session.
Hello to all of my compounding friends and colleagues. My name is Bryan, I'm a compounding workflow and lab design consultant. Amy, I certainly appreciate the warm greeting. I've had the pleasure of consulting for and/or designing between 100 to 150 compounding pharmacies over about the past 7 years or so. And it's been an awesome learning curve, especially as it relates to engineering, which is going to be the initial focus of today's discussion. I also had the pleasure of speaking with the ACHC at all of their USP 800 workshops. So this is really where I like to cut my teeth and talk to you, but we will bob and weave in and out of 797 a little bit today because you'll see how the chapters are actually interchangeable. You're coming in at a real good time now because this is actually the culmination. This presentation is the culmination of a lot of projects working with architects, engineers, and contractors really to help demystify this thing called USP 800. I declare that I have no commercial conflicts that I need to disclose. And as Amy said, at the very end of this, you will actually see the link and get the link for the CE credit. Now, let's talk briefly about the learning objectives. We're going to discuss the varying project and construction costs associated with this. Now, my friends at the ACHC like to call me Bad News Bryan because I'm the one who's going to tell you how much this is going to cost. There are unintended consequences of USP 800, and a lot of that's going to have to do with your pocketbook and the costs involved in that. So we're going to discuss that. We're going to identify the engineering controls necessary to achieve negative pressure. So you as a pharmacy owner or the pharmacist in charge or the designated person or whatever your title is, it's important that you actually understand conceptually so that when you have conversations with your project team, that you'll understand the languages that they're speaking as well. And so part of designing and configuring the HVAC design parameters per USP, this is hugely, hugely important. And I've got a slide that says this is the most important slide, and you'll see that, and it's going to be specific to configuring correct HVAC designs. Now, in the last point, we're going to articulate the importance of project team communication. There's a lot of moving parts and a lot of moving pieces and a lot of people that are going to come and go on this project. And so the communication factor is extremely important, which leads me into this 3D model. USP 797 and USP 800 doesn't actually have a subsection or appendix or some supplementary guide that actually details construction. So over the years, I've created quite a few three-dimensional, I'll call this my sandbox. And really what this does is it helps demystify some of the construction process for those trades that are going to come in, the plumbers, the electricians, the mechanical contractors. Now you see, even as a kind of a silly example, you see this ladder off to the far left over here. This is actually sitting on top of what we call masonite or ram board, or some people would call it craft paper. And the reason why I include this, kind of a silly example, is that once you put down this sheet vinyl flooring that rolls up the wall 6 inches, it gets heat welded. That flooring is going to cost somewhere between $12 to $20 a square foot. So this expensive flooring. And yet there's going to be a subcontractor that comes in because he still has to do some overhead work on the electrical or fire suppression systems or something like that, and they're going to end up gouging and damaging that floor. Now, that has been a lesson learned multiple times to a point where when I build a sandbox, a 3D sandbox, and I get the subcontractors into a Zoom meeting or whatever meeting, we talk about these intimate details. So that just kind of furthers the point that communication with the project team and all of the details is super important. Again, simply because USP 797 and USP 800 doesn't specifically say this is exactly how you're supposed to construct this laboratory environment. Now, I want to kick this off by dissecting Table 2 and Table 3 in the chapter. So in USP 800, you've got Table 2, which is specific to non-sterile compounding, and you've got Table 3, which is a couple pages later or sections later in the chapter, that is specific to sterile hazards. Now, the CPEC, this is called the Containment Primary Engineering Control. That is just a really fancy name for a hood, right? So we may call this a powder hood. We may call it a CVE, a containment ventilated enclosure. We may call it a lot of different things, but the reality is we're going to call that the hood. And then the CSEC, the Secondary Engineering Control, is just a really cool name for the room itself. So that room in which we compound. But these are the cool acronyms we get to use. So first of all, the hood, we have to externally vent it. That means out of the building, or we have to do redundant HEPA filtered in series. I'm actually going to show you what that means in a future slide. And then I'll even show you what some of these hoods and how we would connect those to the external exhaust system and why and when you would want to do that. Now, externally vented on the room, that means out of the building. Now, in the chapter, it doesn't actually say out of the building. So we kind of have to step back and do a little bit of deductive reasoning and say, what do they mean when they say externally vented? The interpretation is out of the building and at 12 air changes per hour. That means, yes, we're going to be pumping perfectly good air out of the building. Now, does the chapter specifically say that you can recirculate some of the air and you can exhaust some of the air as long as you maintain that negative pressure and those number of air changes per hour? It does not. And this is kind of an edgy part, but if we were to really get the true interpretation, then true interpretation for both Table 2 and Table 3 for the CSEC is that there's no opportunity of recirculation of air that's been introduced into a hazardous drug room to then get reintroduced back into the air handler. We would call that one pass air in the HVAC world. And then, of course, landing this negative pressure between 0.01 to 0.03 inches. Now that, let me go ahead and tell you, 2/100ths of a decimal place. Of the rooms that have been integrated out there that are already compliant with USP 800, even though the chapter is not compensally applicable right now, those facilities are finding that 2/100ths of a decimal place is not an easy place to land. And again, I don't know how they came up with that number. It is a slight negative pressure. There's nothing about this that is a vacuum whatsoever, but it is a slight negative pressure, but it's also 2/100ths of a decimal place. And we're going to talk about how to land that number as well. So now let's move down to Table 3 with sterile. So you see with sterile, we have to externally vent the primary engineering control. There is not an exclusion for redundant HEPA. So we know that that biological safety cabinet, which is probably what you're using in that scenario, probably an A2 cabinet, or if you're dealing with a lot of volatile chemicals, you're maybe using a B2 cabinet. And then it also calls out the CACI. Now, CACIs are like the glove box, and those would have to be externally vented as well. I'm not a fan of the ergonomics with a glove box, but if you've got one and it works for you, great. I just don't like seeing people struggle when trying to clean the inside of that. So more than likely, as you move forward, you're going to stay probably in the Class 2, A2, or B2 family. Now, the room, again, has to be externally vented. Again, that means one pass air at 30 air changes per hour. Where did they land that number? Well, that number is a good reference back to USP 797. And you'll see as we're talking about USP 800, there are things that are stated in USP 797 that may not be explicitly stated in 800, but we know that there's an interconnectedness of the two chapters. So the 30 air changes per hour actually then qualifies my sterile hazardous buffer room as an ISO 7 because we know that that is the minimum number of air changes and particle counts to maintain ISO 7. And again, we get that 2/100ths of a decimal place right there. Now, you see the unclassified. I'm not actually going to get into that because that's almost like creating this Table 2 event right here. But neither here nor there, we're going to kind of just step past that and move on because I don't want to drag this out any longer than it should be. Now, this is a perfect example of how we get air into the building and how we get air out of the building. The makeup air unit, which is this blue line, this blue word, this blue arrow. This should be dedicated to the clean room or to the compounding areas specifically. I have a current client and I do a lot of HVAC forensics work, and one of my current clients, originally when the engineer and the architect, they drew the building 5, 6, 7 years ago, they put one really large makeup air unit to supply the retail area, the break rooms, the office spaces, and the clean room and the non-sterile areas with a bunch of VAV valves. And I don't expect you to know what a VAV valve is, but really that's a zone control mechanism, and it's a mess. It's just an incredible, unequivocal mess. So your best practice in the HVAC world, in the clean room world, is that your supply unit is dedicated specifically to those controlled or critical environments known as a clean room, because this makeup air unit needs to hit those temperature and humidity requirements that are actually defined for us in USP 797. We know that is temperature below 20 C, which we know is 68 F, and a relative humidity below 60% relative humidity. So the rest of the facility, again, the retail, the break areas, the offices, or whatever surrounding dispensing areas, patient areas, those can be at controlled room temperature. So we don't need to put expensively controlled air into those other areas, because that's kind of a deal breaker with the wallet. So we want to make sure that if we're designing or retrofitting or remodeling into an existing facility, that we tell our architects and our engineers and our HVAC contractors, we want a dedicated makeup air unit specifically for those controlled environments. That is your best practice. Now let's go to the exhaust blower. This red line, the only way to create negative pressure to quote unquote externally vent is with an exhaust blower. Now there are manufacturers of supply units that say, well, we also have a powered exhaust on our units. Well, it really is a 1-to-1 ratio, which means that they're going to supply 500 CFM and the powered exhaust is going to exhaust 500 CFM. That 1-to-1 ratio does not work for negative pressure. Typically, negative pressure is about 10 to 20%, depending on the size of the space, more than what's being supplied. So let's say that this number is 500 CFM being supplied to the critical environment, a controlled environment. This number would be more like 600 CFM. So I would tell you that do not use the powered exhaust on the makeup air unit to use a dedicated exhaust system, right? Now, the other important thing is how do you land that magical number of 0.01 to 0.03? Really great question. It's called a variable frequency drive. Now, that is a control box that you actually don't see here. It's under the roof. It's going to be in your electrical room or your IT room. If you were to, this is called a direct drive, but let's say that this was an old school belt drive exhaust blower. VFDs don't play well with those belt drive blowers. And so if you want to start adjusting pressures on a belt drive blower, somebody has to actually physically get up on the roof and start messing around with the belts and the pulleys to try and make adjustments real time. That is ineffective, inefficient, and there's no call for that. So the VFD panel, and I tell this to architects, it's on all the drawings, that the VFD panel is essentially our speed control mechanism to be able to adjust this exhaust blower so that we can land this magic number called 0.01 to 0.03. So that is a very important key. Now, I keep using the word important, important, important. I think every one of the slides are absolutely important, especially if we want to get these projects right. But this says this is the most important point, and I cannot emphasize, this is going to be what I call the money maker or the money breaker. And as I mentioned earlier, HVAC forensics is quite a bit of my consulting. I'd say it's about 25% of the total consulting time right now. One of the projects is actually over a year now, because of finger pointing, is actually now going to the lawyers, which is never where you want to see a project to go. And where it started is with the architect saying to the pharmacy, oh, I understand how to build clean rooms. And what they did is they spec'd in what's called a single stage compressor unit. Now, a single stage compressor unit is exactly what you have at your house, or if you're in a small strip mall or any type of commercial strip mall, you have what's called a single stage compressor. That means that when the thermostat reaches that design point or that set point, let's say that you're running it at 71 degrees today, and when that thermostat hits 71, it detects that the environment is 71, it sends a signal back to the air handler that the compressor can cut off. When the compressor cuts off, to stop managing the temperature, it also stops managing the humidity, because here's what happens is that humidity says right here, humidity control is only a byproduct of temperature control. So if you've got a standard single stage DX compressor unit that cycles on, cycles off, cycles on, cycles off, now you've lost control of your humidity. But you got to understand that the DX unit, the single stage, was only meant to control temperature. So during April, starting in April, May, June, July, August, I start getting these phone calls. Bryan, we cannot maintain our temperature and our humidity, mostly our humidity standards in our clean room. Now, so I say, first question, what does your SOP say as an excursion event? So if you don't have an SOP that talks about excursion events on your clean room, you probably need to write one. An excursion event means that when our clean room, and this is kind of how it states on the SOP, when our clean room reaches 73 degrees and or 65% relative humidity, we have to stop compounding because that is an excursion on our clean room and it's no longer within a specification for us to be compounding inside of that. Now, what happens when you stop compounding? Patient care struggles and you're not making any money. So now let's kind of flash forward over to, or step sideways over to these blue boxes called the modulating compressor. Some people will call it a dual stage compressor, some call it a digital scroll compressor, but it is a modulating compressor and the compressor. And the cool thing is that it reads both temperature and humidity as independent variables. And now, why is that important? Well, before I get into, well, I've already stated what USP 797 says, but let me talk briefly about the natural laws of physics. Pressure goes from high to low. It's higher outside of the space than it is inside of a clean room. A clean room is 0.02 inches positive on the non-hazardous side and 0.01 inches negative. So it's a very small, minor air pressure as opposed to say like the barometric pressure outside, which is much heavier. So pressure goes from high to low. Warm air is attracted to cold air. And what is the temperature inside of our clean rooms after I've got on a rear tying gown, double shoe covers, double gloves, hair bouffant, and mask? Or if you're in some of your clean rooms, maybe you're wearing a Tyvek suit. Well, I want that room to be about 64, 65 degrees is what I want that room to be at if I'm in there working for employee comfort. And then moisture, all moisture is attracted to dry air. So let's think about what we just said. A clean room is a low pressure, cold box with dry air. That means that natural laws of physics, we just created a virtual sponge for all external factors trying to get into it. So your clean room, due to the air changes, due to the air handling, due to the engineering, is always trying to fight off those natural laws of physics. So if I were having a conversation with an engineer right now, I would say, you need to target on the design criteria of your dedicated makeup air unit for this clean room, 65 degrees Fahrenheit at 50% relative humidity. That is your design. Now, when engineers are designing specifications for a makeup air unit, they also have access to what's called a psychometric chart. And that is a cool word. Sometimes we just call it a psych chart as a shorter terminology. But as you start to move on that psych chart, closer beyond the parameters, you start to hit what's called the saturation point. At that saturation point, the system, the compressors can no longer wring out the moisture. And I'm in South Carolina. I don't know if you can tell by the really cool Southern accent that I got, but here in the South, we have a lot of hot, moist times, especially right now, even though it is going into, it's late September, it's still quite warm here, right? So our clean rooms would essentially still be fighting off some of that moisture, some of that humidity outside. Now, if you live in a mild area, hey, good for you, but there's still a lot of places around the US that have extreme temperatures, lows and highs, as well as rainy seasons and monsoon seasons and all these things. So I cannot emphasize enough that if you don't want your lawyers to end up getting involved because your clean room cannot meet temperature and humidity, the architect blew it, the engineer blew it, the HVAC contractor blew it, and everybody in the chain said, oh no, we've got experience with clean rooms. That's why it's important that all along the way, that communication with USP standards is absolutely and unequivocally key. So I spent the most amount of time on this slide. I'm going to give you that last part of bad news, Bryan. These red boxes, you'll get this installed for, I don't know, $15,000 to $20,000 for your clean room. Love it, perfect. 15 to 20, we can absorb that into the budget. These blue boxes are going to go 40 to 60,000. So I just went 2.5x on the budget to go from a single stage compressor to a modulating compressor that reads humidity and temperature as independent variables. So the question is this, if Do you want your clean room and or your controlled or critical environments or your negative pressure rooms to have an uptime of 97 to 98% and not hit an excursion event? The answer is obviously yes. The question is can your budget absorb 2.5x? And I've actually had some smaller pharmacies that said to me, Bryan, we don't see a $40,000 makeup air unit going into this space. It's not part of our budget. To which I say, I certainly understand it. It's your money, it's your pocketbook, but the reality is that if you do not want your clean room to fall out of spec, number one, your engineer's got to design it correct, but number two, you really need to consider the modulating compressor, temperature and humidity as separate factors. So I spent a lot of time on that because I really felt like that was probably the most important slide. This is a picture of the ductwork. The ductwork for a clean room is going to get real busy real fast. In the next slide, you're going to see how we've got 3 different duct lines going in 3 different directions that we've got to account for. And this is where people start to get in trouble with retrofitting spaces, is that the mechanical contractor has to get real creative. And you'll see that again on the next slide. So here's the biggest takeaway. Flexible fiberglass ductwork does not work for a clean room, a controlled or critical environment. There's too much airflow, there's too much pressure, there's too much stuff going on. And typically now, in these type of commercial environments, the local mechanical building code will say, yes, metal ductwork, and we've got to make sure it's sealed and we've got to make sure it's wrapped. So I say this not that it needs to be said, but it really kind of does need to be said, if I can contradict myself. So notice this metal ductwork, and we used to call this Pookie back in the day, but now it's called mastic or duct sealant. HVAC guys still know what I mean when I say Pookie. And then we're going to take it to the next step, which is actually insulating it and wrapping it. Now, why do we want to insulate it and wrap it? If we want to get that air into the clean room and maintain that 65 degrees Fahrenheit, again, I'm wearing rear tying gowns, double shoe covers, double gloves, hair bouffant mask. I'm kind of sweating in there a little bit, so I want it to be 65. That means this air getting delivered down this ductwork is coming in at 52 to 55 degrees. So it's cold. Now, what is the temperature in this unconditioned interstitial space? We don't know. And in certain areas, it gets really hot, really warm because this is not conditioned space. So hot, unconditioned air and cold ductworks, it's like taking a can of Coca-Cola and putting it in your attic space. What's going to happen? It's going to start to sweat over time because it condenses. That's why you want to insulate it and wrap it so that if it does start to drip or condensate over time, and hopefully it doesn't with insulation, it will not drip on top of your clean room, because if it starts dripping on top of your clean room and you start seeing discolored tiles, that's a place where CFUs are going to be harboring, and you've got to now shut down the clean room or the controlled environment so that you can go up there and get that leaking to stop. So it's important that this slide goes further to your HVAC contractor. Now, earlier when I said it's going to take up a lot of room, ductwork does take up a lot of room, and this is one of the models that I recently built to show the HVAC contractor all the different lines. So our supply air is coming in all of these silver lines going to our fan filter units and diffusers. The green lines are the return air going from our non-hazardous area. So in this situation, I would have a standard positive pressure clean room doing eye drops, ear drops, whatever I'm doing inside of there. But because it's non-hazardous, I can recirculate that air back into the air handler or back into the system. But the red lines are coming off of my biological safety cabinet, off of my my powder hood that I'm doing my hazardous drug weighing in, and my low wall. So the red lines are coming out of my hazardous area. So notice I've got 3 different duct lines: supply, return, and exhaust. So if above your interstitial space, you've only, or above your ceiling tiles right now, you've only got maybe 18 to 24 inches worth of space, you may have a real difficult time satisfying USP 800 in the future. So I did a podcast not too long ago, and it was, is this building going to work for your pharmacy? So if you're out shopping for real estate, qualifying that building first. Now, hey, great that it used to be a dentist office, and that was actually the story that I used, is that this particular pharmacy went out and bought a former dentist office. And in the end, after they bought it, they called me later. We finally figured out there was no way you were going to move all the ductwork through that space. Plus, it was inadequate. It didn't have 3-phase power, didn't have natural gas, had a lot of different things kind of going on. But if you're out shopping for real estate, qualifying the building first for USP, for design and construction is more important than the fact that it used to be a dentist office or a chiropractor's office, or it's in a strip mall or in a medical mall where I've got the natural synergy to all these providers. And I appreciate that, right? If you're heavy in HRT and you've got a lot of OBGYNs and women's health specialty providers in that strip mall, yeah, you absolutely want to be in that medical mall area. But if the building doesn't work, the building doesn't work. And so the takeaway from this is qualify the space and understand that there's a lot happening with the ductwork now for USP 800. Again, one of those unintended consequences. So what is the problem with negative pressure? Well, it sure does suck. And that's a fun joke that if we were live, sometimes I get chuckles. And now that I can't see your faces, obviously, it seems like a really bad joke, like a dad joke. But anyway, I'll move on. CFUs come from everywhere. So the fact that we've now got rooms under negative pressure, we never had to worry about this before under USP 797. We were just basically blowing all the positive air out, right? We never had to worry about pulling air from an unsealed ceiling tile into an interstitial space. So you got to understand that CFUs come from everywhere, and we need to consider the door locations. So let's jump over to the graphic. This is design A and this is design B. So this is what they started with and this is what it ended with. So imagine you've got a technician coming into from an unclassified area, and they're going to do their initial PPE, put on their hair bouffant, their mask, step over the line of demarcation with their shoe booties, but now they are still unguarded because the hand hygiene sink is on the clean side of the demarcation. So they're walking unguarded by a negative pressure door. Now it's very likely that negative pressure door is not wide open like it is in the drawing, but the reality is it's still not a best practice to have unguarded technicians walking by a negative pressure door to get to a hand hygiene sink. So the question is, what is the solution? We jump next over to the design. Basically, we just flip-flop the sink and the door. It was an easy settle, right? Flip-flop the sink and the door. So now when the technician comes in, they do their initial PPE, they step over the line of demarcation, they do hand hygiene, they finish their garbing here, and now they can move on into either space without having to pass by a negative pressure door. So if you're currently working with an architect or a design firm or a modular wall company, whoever you're working with, think through the process. This is part of that workflow understanding. What am I carrying? Am I carrying totes? How am I doing my PPE? Is my hand hygiene sink on the clean side, the dirty side, or wherever it's at? How am I moving people and process, and where are my doors? So again, just kind of step away from it and think about it. You also want to caulk and clamp those ceiling tiles and caulk the ceiling grid to the wall. So imagine that 0.01 to 0.03 negative pressure. Again, it's not a significant negative pressure, but it is enough negative pressure that if your ceiling grid is not caulked to the wall, it's very likely you could be pulling that dirty air from above the ceiling down into your ISO rated clean room. So we want to caulk the perimeter of the grid to the wall, and we want to make sure that all the ceiling grids are clamped from above or caulked from below. Now, there is a couple of states out there that they absolutely want to see the caulking. Let me just jump over to the model real fast. I want to show you this as part of the design criteria, just kind of bring light to that. So where the ceiling grid matches the wall, you want to make sure that there's caulking there, right? Super important that because that is a space. Now we're essentially trying to create a submarine hatch, and we can't always do that. I'm sorry, that went a little bit faster. And then we want to make sure that we're clamping from above, right? What we're trying to do is get good natural compression to the ceiling grid so that none of that dirty air gets pulled into my ISO rated air areas. I'm also wanting to foam fill my electrical boxes. If you're stick framing it, if you're doing a modular wall system, then you don't have to worry about that. And then you want to consider airlocks between certain rooms. And the next slide, I'm going to show you how to integrate an airlock. That is actually mentioned in USP 797, not mentioned in 800, but certainly very much applicable so that we don't move lesser quality air into higher quality air rooms. And then consider a vapor barrier if we're going to stick frame that. And I should have let the model up so that I can show you that real fast. Now, when we talk about a vapor barrier, that is actually going to go on top of the gypsum. I'm sorry, let me move back over here. So if I'm stick framing this, again, this is not modular. I'm going to have my metal studs, my gypsum wall, but I'm going to put up a poly vapor barrier first. Now, when we talk about vapor barriers, we're not talking about Tyvek house wrap with a perm rating of 56. We're actually talking about like an 8 mil poly. And the reason why is we want to make sure that none of that outside vapor, none of that outside heat is coming into that space. Remember what I told you earlier, that a clean room is a virtual sponge for all things vapor related. Now, here is your other best practice, which is an absolute in my mind. If this wall right here is the exterior of the building, you do not want to do a clean room, or if you do, you want to build a wall within a wall. So here's the point. Utilizing the building's exterior wall as part of your clean room is setting yourselves up for CFUs. You're not going to get ahead of your surface sampling, your all the sampling you got to do as part of your environmental monitoring program. If you use a building exterior wall as part of your clean room, you're going to set yourself up for problems because you do not know if the wall has a vapor barrier, if it's insulated, you have no idea. So you want to build a wall within a wall, which is one of the benefits of actually going modular, because that does essentially create walls within walls. So I think we kind of beat that one up pretty good. Let's move to the next slide. Here is the shared anteroom versus the airlock. So let's call this design criteria A. If you notice, all of these rooms share air. So my anti-prep room, right, and there would be the line of demarcation here. So I'm doing everything in here that's non-hazardous prep and or hand hygiene. It shares air going into the HD prep. This would be high risk. So if I'm doing like, I don't know, testosterone injectables or something like that, so I'm going from non-sterile to sterile. So I'm pulling in air in here, and that same air is getting pulled into the sterile HD buffer. So in this example, all of these rooms are essentially sharing air, which means the entire clean room needs to be rated as an ISO 7. Now, some folks will say, well, I like for my technicians to be able to move between room to room without having to go back and reperform hand hygiene. I appreciate that as well. However, with hazardous, it gets a little bit more of a sticky widget to allow them to take potentially contaminated garb from one hazardous area to another, and we would definitely never let them take potentially soiled garb out of a hazardous room into a positive pressure space. So it is okay if you're sharing air, then you're going to do an all ISO 7 rated environment. Or if you say, I don't know about all the particles getting generated in this anti-prep because I've got my depyrogenation oven, only because the FDA said that I had to. I know some people are like, wait a minute, why would you put a depyrogenation oven in an ISO rated environment? Because that's a burn now with the FDA where they want to see that inside of an ISO rated area. So imagine I've got non-hazardous, high risk weighing, I've got hand hygiene, I've got garbing, I've got a depyro oven. I don't know if I'm going to be able to maintain ISO 7 in this space. So I want to rate that as an ISO 8, because legitimately, if I'm doing pre-sterilization weighing activity, I can do that inside of an ISO 8 because USP 797 says that I absolutely can. So I'm actually going to add an airlock. Now the airlock, which is not present here, but added to the same design, essentially what that does now is that allows me to break up the spaces. And I'm sorry, I didn't have the cursor before, but this is the same design A, same design B, except for we added now an airlock right here. So what I've done is this area where the depyro oven is, hand hygiene, high risk weighing, can now get rated as an ISO 8. And so maybe my environmental sampling isn't quite as intensive, and I'm not as concerned about keeping this as an ISO 7. And I'm doing the HD prep. Again, I may be weighing testosterone or any other dry API before going to final filtering or terminal sterilization, whatever you're doing, by just breaking up 2 ISO spaces with that airlock. I hope that made sense. Now, I put this in as a last slide, or not the last slide, but just as a last minute, because I've actually seen this design twice in the past, I'm saying 3 months. And I don't know why these are coming across my desk as, hey, what do you think about this, Brian? Well, I don't like it at all, and I'll tell you why. I've got an unclassified hallway. Let's say that this is I don't know, patient area, or maybe this is the back door. Maybe I've got a break room and I'm going unclassified up to the front, or vice versa. And I've got to step into an ISO 8 hazardous drug prep room. Again, maybe I'm doing high risk pre-sterilization weighing of testosterone to go to the injectables or whatever. I've got my depyro oven inside of here. Again, USP 797 says that I can actually have a room for pre-sterilization weighing activity as ISO 8 or better, and that's what I've done. But now I'm pulling unclassified air into a negatively pressured ISO rated space. The FDA will probably consider that an insanitary condition. So I sent this up to a couple of my friends. Actually, I emailed USP and asked them about it. And they made me notice that everywhere in USP 797, which is also applicable to USP 800, it always mentions that entry into a classified space always happens through an anteroom. But this doesn't have an actual anteroom. It needs to have an anteroom. And the only way to basically put that would be right there, but then you're probably going to get into fire egress standards or other problem, or maybe retrofit it over here. But here's the takeaway of this slide. You do not pull unclassified air into an ISO-rated environment. That is going to be an insanitary condition. And I'm hoping, and what's interesting about this particular room, which has been in process for a while, the state board or whoever, whatever compliance has never caught that to say, wait, what are you doing again? But this is a no-no moving forward with hazardous drug handling. Now, the design goal, which is called out in USP 797, again, applicable to 800, is that we want to move the air from the ceiling to the floor to make sure that the room is getting good dilution. So USP 797 references to what's called low wall, I think they call them low wall returns or low wall grills. In a hazardous drug room, we're going to call them low wall exhaust because they're exhausted out of the building, and the biological safety cabinet is also exhausted out of the building. There is a carve out that says if you use a ceiling return or a ceiling exhaust, you've got to prove that with a smoke study. And I can tell you from talking to my friends in the certification business, you'll never achieve that. And again, that's part of the lawsuit that I mentioned earlier, is that they didn't actually integrate the low walls. There's no dilution. They can't pass a smoke study. It's just a big mess. So the design goal, again, is to move air from the ceiling down to the floor. And I want you to know that that is applicable also for non-sterile. It's not called out on tables 2 in USP 800, and I get that, but the reality is if I'm handling powder, I'm doing capsules, I'm doing troches, I'm doing creams, I'm doing anything that requires me to handle a dry API. And my technicians, bless their heart, they keep pulling their hands out of that powder hood to go retrieve another weigh boat or to go get another tamper for the capsule plates or whatever it is. They keep pulling their hands out. When they aerosolize that micron sized powder, I want that airflow to essentially push it all the way down to the floor, because in a non-sterile environment, referencing to 795, I've got to clean that floor every single day. So you see, again, there's a huge interconnectedness of all three of these chapters. Whether or not USP 800 actually specifically calls it out, we know that there's a reference. So this is the way that you want to design. And again, USP 797 says that HEPA filtered air must be introduced at the ceiling. I did see a project where they tried to introduce HEPA filtered air from the makeup air unit. It had to travel 30 or 40 feet down the supply ductwork, and it would not pass the particle counts by the time it made it into its room. And also USP 797 would have debunked that anyway. So HEPA filtered air must be introduced at the ceiling. Now, here's an example of some of those low walls. I've taken these pictures at various job sites. These are fabricated on site. There's not many companies that actually make a prefab. There's a couple that make prefabricated, but a lot of times these are made on the job site. And so you see those examples. I see these egg crates out there in the market, and I don't know if you can really see that from your perspective, but there's about 1/4 of an inch or more reveal inside of every one of those egg crates. And I don't like cleaning stuff, right? I'm never going to be a good person to clean a clean room. It's just not going to happen for me. You can ask my wife, she'll verify that I'm not a good cleaner. But this egg crate, as an example, is just going to be a nightmare. But I see a lot of these out there. So difficult to clean. And where do you see the specifications for all of this? In the mechanical plan. So if you're working currently with an architect or an engineer, you've got a set of A sheets, M sheets, E sheets, and P sheets. That's mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and the A sheets are, of course, the architectural sheets. On the M sheet, the mechanical sheets, usually like 2.1 or 1.2, they call all this stuff out. Do not let your engineers have open season to determine what type of grills. And then I see a lot of these as well. Very common, but again, difficult to clean. These are angled slats, and I don't want to have to clean all that. So what is the answer? Lattice face. I discovered this not too long ago out in the market. It's flat. It's not like the egg crate. There's no other surfaces except for basically to wipe this. And in a future state, per USP 800, when you have to DDCD, deactivate, decontaminate, clean, and disinfect, is that a 2-step process, 3-step process? Who knows, right? That's up to you, and how that's a little outside of my purview. I would not want to have to DDCD either of these two designs. I would rather do the lattice face. So that's my advice. If you want to make something easy to clean, make it a lattice face. Now, room pressure monitors. What's interesting is that actively monitoring the hazardous drug room pressure is not actually mentioned in the chapter. Well, you go, Ron, that kind of seems a little bit like deductive reasoning, doesn't it? Yeah, absolutely. The chapter calls from 01 to 03. How do I know it's actually performing? Well, I actually had a pharmacy who they were USP 800 ready. And when I asked them the question, I'm like, where's the room pressure monitor? How do you know you're maintaining that pressure? Well, my HVAC contractor says that I was. Okay, cool. Well, I see that you've got a ceiling grill as an exhaust. Is there an exhaust blower up on the roof? And how's that getting out of the building? I don't know. My HVAC person handled all that. I don't know that a state board of pharmacy is going to let all that fly. I certainly know that an accreditation arm is not going to let all that fly. So even though a room pressure monitor is not specifically called out in the chapter, if you've got a pressurized environment, negative, positive, or whatever, and it's called out in USP, you got to put in a room pressure monitor. This Magna Helix gauge, old school analog technology, going to go about $85, or you can step up to digital technology, and this goes in upwards of $1,000. There's probably somewhere in the middle with the price points, but you can see analog versus digital in the market. Eventually, if you wanted to start doing active monitoring or pulling all the data up into a cloud later on, you would absolutely have to go digital. So I should do your research on that. I'm not going to get into all that, but again, actively monitoring the room pressure validates that I'm actually landing that number of negative pressure as it's called out in the chapter. Now, the question I get is, can I use my existing hoods? And the answer is yes. You can use your existing class 1 powder hoods. This is for non-sterile. This would be under table 2, non-sterile. Most powder hoods in the market will have a 2-inch or 3-inch or sometimes a 4-inch single HEPA filter. In that scenario, you've got to externally exhaust it out of the building per table 2. That means that you've got to call up the manufacturer and you've got to request that they send you their thimble or their canopy connection, which makes it negative at the makeup gap, and then a local damper control. And the reason why you need a local damper control is actually for the certification company. Anytime you put a fan on the roof and there's a fan on the hood, you've got 2 fans in line with each other. They're going to fight. They are going to fight. Now, naturally, you want them to make a perfect handoff somewhere up the duct line, but you don't know where that's going to happen. And that's why it's important for you to have a localized damper so that either the test and balance company, which is an extension of your HVAC company, or another contractor, or your certifier have access to control so that they don't overwhelm this face velocity because the roof exhaust is wide open. Now, while I'm on this slide, I was at a pharmacy last week. They had a monitor that was showing that their powder hood was doing 118 feet per minute at the face open. You're like, what does that really mean? Well, if you're handling micronized powder like a progesterone or any light fluffy powder and you're weighing it in a powder hood, you want that face velocity to be closer to 75 to 80 linear feet per minute. That's a low flow, because if you're weighing on a spatula and you start to see your powder whisking off, or your 3 places, 4 places to the right of the decimal analytical balance can't get stability, it's because there's too much velocity on this powder hood. Powder hoods are not like biological safety cabinets. A biological safety cabinet will have 105 feet per minute at the face. You only want 75 to 80 feet per minute when you're weighing out powders, especially hazardous drug powder, because I don't want those blowing all over. And plus, I don't know what the gram cost of hormone drugs are these days. But anyway, slow your powder hoods down. And then also this damper control will keep that exhaust blower on the roof from overwhelming the powder hood as well. Now, what is a redundant HEPA filter? This is table 2. I should have actually called it out as table 2. This is the carve out that basically says you can recirculate air back into that space. Let me show you that on the model real fast. Try not to zoom around and make you sick. Let me zoom around. Let's go into this. So here's the difference between a single HEPA hood. See how I've got it connected up to the exhaust blower, but the redundant HEPA hood is not exhausted, so it's recirculating. Now, little misnomer about hoods. Hoods that are recirculating into the space do not contribute to the negative pressure at all, right? They are room neutral. The velocity that it pulls equals the velocity and volume that it puts out. It is room neutral. It does not actually contribute to the negative pressure. What does contribute to the negative pressure is getting the single HEPA filtered hood out of the exhaust blower out on the roof or the low wall exhaust going out. That is what's generating the negative pressure in that space. But I don't personally like connecting hoods. Many moons ago, when I was in the engineer containment, which is a fancy name for the hood business, I did not like to see people connect hoods to exhaust systems because they're fickle. Whenever these HEPA filters start to get full with powders, the pressure drops. And this is a constant volume fan, not a variable speed fan. Sorry, I had to take a swallow of water there. They will start to impact what is happening with that negative pressure. And that's a lot to take in, but I would recommend that if you're planning out a new facility, a new project, that you absolutely use redundant HEPA filtered air, let them recirculate into the space, and let the low wall actually do the exhaust. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. These hoods are recirculating, and I'm letting all of that air generating the negative pressure from the low wall go up. And this is a perfect model for non-sterile hazardous right here. If you want to show this to your HVAC people, or you want to show this to your engineer, this is a good, perfect model of how we want to generate negative pressure. Now let's do some quick calculations. I won't get too deep into this because I'm actually, you know what, I've got 7 more minutes and 7 more slides. I tell you what, I'll let you work out the math. It's not difficult to work out to the math, but understand this is a perfect table 2 redundant HEPA filtered air model. Now, let's go back. Hold on, I think I jumped a slide. I did not, I apologize. As it gets later, I get a little more spastic. I apologize, I'm trying to get in under the gun here. So this is a perfect hazardous drug sterile model. So this would be table 3, sterile compounding. My biological safety cabinet is connected with their manufacturer's canopy. It's going out the duct line. I've also got a low wall exhaust connecting to that, and it goes out, and I've got a dedicated makeup air unit going directly into my fan filter unit. This is the perfect table 3 model. So if you're planning a project, show this either to your engineer and or your mechanical contractor, your HVAC people, and the math is all there for them to calculate. Now, this, I briefly mentioned this earlier. So this would be like a table 2 non-sterile, where I've got my powder hood, single HEPA, connected externally, and I've got my low wall exhaust externally connected. And so this is what's generating the negative pressure. But look also what I'm doing. I'm letting my air handler supply air and another low wall return on the other side of the room recirculate. This is not one pass air. This is not the interpretation of USP 800. And I know for a fact that this is being done out there because the chapter does not explicitly state that there's no opportunity for hazardous drug air to get recirculated back to the air handler. I realize there's a gap in the language, but I just want you to know that this is not a good interpretation of USP 800. Could you still generate 0.01 to 0.03 negative pressure? Yes, if this air exceeded this air, you certainly could. But I would ask that you not recirculate air from a hazardous drug room back into that space. Now, I'm going to hit a couple of slides on materials of construction. It's not as fun as the engineering, but I want to just bring these up. Homogeneous sheet vinyl, this is absolutely the way to go, right? Again, it's a couple of different manufacturers out there that specialize in this healthcare type. You roll it up the wall, the heat seam, this is just a really good flooring example right here. Epoxy is also acceptable. However, let me tell you that if there's a concrete surface that you're laying epoxy on, it's got to be grinded to a perfect 10 grit finish. It's got to be prepped. You've got to drill it for slab sample to make sure that there's no moisture in the slab. You've got to lay multiple coats. You've got to get the mill thickness. You've got to lay a poly coat on top of it. It is such a mess to actually get epoxy right. Now, of the projects that I've seen epoxy go down, 3 of the 5 have failed in the field. So if you've got a large space, I understand that is cost prohibitive because this is probably $12 to $20 a square foot. This is more like 6 to 10 a square foot, but you've got a higher likelihood of the epoxy failing over time if it's a high traffic area. So I would dissuade you from that as a material of construction. You do not have to code the walls. USP 797 actually says that if you do a 90-degree angle, that you do have to just caulk that joint. But if you're going with vinyl, 100%, roll it up the wall. There's very little additional cost that is associated with rolling it up the wall 4 to 6 inches. This is an important one. Earlier when I talked about caulking the ceiling tiles, There's a such thing as a paper-backed vinyl face tile, right? It still has the vinyl face, but it's a paperback. It only weighs about 1 pound for a 2x4 tile. Or there's a gypsum back tile. We call it a vinyl rock tile, also with a vinyl face, and it weighs 16 pounds. So the integrity and the tightness of the negative pressure room is everything. Remember, I told you earlier, try to think submarine hatch, submarine hatch. You've got to caulk the ceiling grid to the wall. You've got to clamp those tiles. Well, what do you feel like is going to get a good natural compression to the ceiling grid, a 1 pound tile or a 16 pound tile? Now, these 16 pound tiles are 4x the cost. So if this is a $2, this is an $8 tile. So yes, it's going to increase the cost. But in the end, I'd rather see you go with a gypsum back or a vinyl rock tile with a vinyl face versus a paper back product. Now, materials of construction. Earlier, I mentioned modular walls. I love modular walls. You get that glass that's flush with the surface. It's very difficult to replicate that if you stick frame it, or if you do stick frame it with the gypsum earlier. This is what FRP looks like. They did a phenomenal job of caulking this. They actually didn't use those strips. The strips that you can buy with FRP is terrible. It never lays flat. So I would dissuade you from that. But they did a phenomenal job stick framing this project and then laying FRP. And then this is epoxy with a urethane coat on top of it. Now I'm seeing epoxy paint, standard base coat plus 2 additional coats on top of that, water-based, failing off the wall, because eventually you've got, even if it's non-sterile, you've got to do the DDCD process. And if you want to peel epoxy off the wall, use a water base. Or if you don't want to peel the epoxy off the wall, you can also use a urethane top coat. And they did a great job on this urethane top coat. You can see though that epoxy paint looks a little bit what I like to call goopy. But in the end, if you use a urethane top coat, it does look good. So that's all I'm going to talk about on materials of construction. I could talk that to death. I've got that model that I showed you. And I'm coming up close to my time, and I'm sure the rest of you have got other things you need to be doing today. Here is the link. Amy's also going to send that out to you later. And let me jump right into questions or comments, because I realized that I went really fast there with the questions and the comments. I'm sorry, with the presentation.
Thank you, Bryan. That was great. Remind attendees you can still submit questions in the Go to Webinar Toolbox under the Questions tab, and it looks like we have several that have come in.
Right, okay, let's see here. I love this question. Does an 800 room need a dedicated ante-room for garbing, or can this be done in the same room? Now, great question. If it is a table 2 non-sterile negative pressure compound room, you are not required to have an ante-room. Now, stay away from that word ante, because that implies an isolated environment. If you're going to have an entry room prior to going into a non-sterile hazardous room, we're going to call that a gowning room. See how benign that word is? Gowning room doesn't imply that it's an ante space. So you are not required. Actually, I answered that on a Facebook compounding group one time. Somebody said, well, my consultant said that you had to have one. You do not. The chapter does not call that out. Is it a best practice? Absolutely. Even if I'm going into a non-sterile hazardous compounding room, if you can integrate a gowning room, which would be positively pressured even to the hallway by over pressurizing it, that is a best practice, but not a requirement. Question, how do you know if USP 800 is required in our state? Well, right now there's only 2, maybe 3 states that are actually enforcing it. It's very unlikely your state is enforcing it because it is not quote unquote contingently applicable, because USP 795 and 797 are not finalized yet with the beyond use dating issues. So you've got about a 92% chance that your state is not enforcing it, or you want to reach out to your state and ask them what their plans are. Question, natural gas, question mark, why? Natural gas, good question. So if you've got access to natural gas, it'll make that dedicated makeup air unit work a lot more efficient than what we call an electric reheat. So here in the South, in the middle of July, I'm pulling in outdoor air at say 92 degrees at 75% relative humidity. That makeup air unit has to wring all that moisture out of the system prior to it introducing it downstream into my hazardous drug room. But to do that, it actually has to supercool the air and then reheat the air to get it back to that 65, 68. Natural gas will make the process of reheat more efficient. So earlier when I said natural gas, I'm sorry that was vague, but natural gas is more of an energy efficient quotient that you could add to your makeup air unit, and I would highly recommend it. And this is, no, you don't have to have natural gas to run your exhaust blower. That is straight electric. Three-phase electric, if you're looking at new buildings or you're looking at anything, three-phase electric is the way to go. If you're still trying to run a dedicated makeup air unit off of single-phase electric, you're going to cost yourself an arm and a leg on your electricity bill month to month. So if you're out shopping for real estate, one of the qualifiers of that real estate is three-phase power with a strong preference towards natural gas. Great question, by the way. You showed a picture of air handling equipment on a flat roof. What if our pharmacy does not have a flat roof? Good question. You actually then would do what's called a split unit, where the air handler would go either above the ceiling horizontally or in a mechanical closet vertically. Your condenser goes outside, but you still have to have a roof penetration for fresh air and another roof penetration for an exhaust blower. So you still have to make those penetrations. You still have to account for that fresh air. But if you've got a pitched roof, an A-frame roof, you can still accomplish it. Instead of a flat roof, you'd have to go with what's called a split unit. Let's see here. Idea of sink exit room. See if I can understand this. What do you think? Highly Dimitri, I'm not exactly sure how to answer the idea of a sink exit room. That's more of like a 503B CGMP thing, where you've got an entry exit and an exit ante, or a entry ante and an exit ante. I don't know. I have to think through that on paper before I can really answer that. Does the air handler supply enough air in the negative pressure room? Makeup air. Wouldn't you need additional makeup air from another external source? Okay, so if the air handler is configured up front, and let's just say this is you're only doing non-sterile hazardous compounding, that unit would be what's called a 100% outdoor air unit. 100% of the air gets pulled in, conditioned, put into the space. 100% of that air is then externally exhausted through the blower. So your makeup air unit needs to be designed and configured. All the outside air is equal to, in a one-to-one relationship of that which was being exhausted. I hope that made sense. One-to-one ratio, the outside air being introduced into the makeup air unit equals the outside air getting exhausted out of the exhaust blower. Let's see, hold on, I'm reading this question, stand by. If you're leasing your building, is the makeup air unit and blower something you can take to your new building? The answer is, if you're looking at moving, I would say absolutely take your $70,000 worth of equipment with you. But here's the conversation you need to have with your landlord. I'm going to be doing capital improvements to your building. I want what's called TI money. That's called tenant improvement money. I'm investing $150,000, $200,000, $300,000 into your building to bring my rooms up to spec per compliance. And I need to know that if, yes, I'm willing to sign another 10 years on that lease, but you're willing to give me what's called tenant improvement money. TI money is what we call it, TI money. And if they say, no, I'm not willing to share any TI money, then when you leave, you make sure that you have in your contract that $50,000 makeup air unit and that $6,000 exhaust blower is going with me on the back of a flatbed truck. Which room do you place the thermostat? Okay, great. So if you've got multiple rooms within the clean room, you would put it in the most critical, right? So you would put that in one of your two buffers. If you've got a positive buffer and a negative buffer, you would want to put it in probably the positive buffer, because I'm guessing that is where the majority of the people in the process are occurring. So the room that has the tendency to generate the most amount of heat is where you want to put that thermostat. If you say, well, in my anti-prep space, there's a lot of heat getting generated in there because of the deep pyro oven and autoclave, whatever you're going on, then you would put it in there. Wherever there's the most amount of people in process, which we call heat gain, is where you want to put the thermostat. So you've got worst case scenario of that thermostat or a humidistat communicating back to the makeup air unit. Great questions. Let me see if I covered everybody's question. And Heidi said, yes, that's 503B. Yes, Heidi, I would do for 503B, the FDA and CGMP wants to see process and people in one direction. So you would do an entry ante and an exit ante. I don't know that I would have an exit ante where I doff potentially hazardous drug garb if it's been soiled. I would want to do that under negative pressure. And an exit ante would be naturally positively pressured. So you want to think through that. Where are people actually going to doff hazardous drug garb prior to leaving out the exit ante, which is positively pressured to the unclassified space? I know that was a lot to take in. I hope that made sense. If not, there's my email address. Let's hash this thing out. Do you have a preference for casework, tables, or cabinets? I'm a huge fan of what's called the open shelving concept. I'm gonna pull up this model one more time. Now, again, you have to DDCD, deactivate, decontaminate, clean, and disinfect. I would rather you do the open shelving concept. If somebody says, hey, what does your workstation look like? Well, this is my perfect workstation. I've got weigh boats, straws, other things happening in here, maybe in here, or clean dishes. And I've got all my APIs. I'm doing all my capsules here. This, for me, when I have to do that DDCD process, this is going to be the easiest thing for me to clean. I pull these totes out, I wipe it, I DDCD it, deactivate, decontaminate, clean, disinfect, and then I'm moving on about my business. Cabinets, and I've got lots of great pictures. Drawers and cabinets are the worst things anybody ever put into a non-sterile compounding pharmacy. And I know this is very controversial, but whenever I walk into a compounding pharmacy, non-sterile, and I see cabinets, I see fixtures, I see drawers, it just drives me crazy, because I will take my UV flashlight and then I will shine it into the drawer and I will show them, or into the cabinet and show them where actual powder is. Every time I will find it. My advice moving forward, you have to, this is how the chapter reads. Due to difficulty of cleaning hazardous drugs, all surfaces must be smooth and pervious, free from cracks and crevices, and non-shedding. I don't know if you can accomplish all that with drawers and cabinets, but you can accomplish that with an open shelving concept, which is what I would much rather you do. And that may be all the questions. Let me just scroll through here, Amy, and I'll give it back to you. What kind of light fixture is best? Good question. I'm gonna hop back to that real fast. LED, 100%. Oh, sorry, I went too far. I apologize. I went in the wrong direction. I'm so spastic right now. All right, this is a flat panel sealed LED. There's a lot of companies that make them, but it is sealed. So when I'm running my clean room mop over that surface, it's not gonna snag. If you've got old halogen bulbs right now, go ahead and take those fixtures out, throw them away, and replace them with these LED fixtures. These LED fixtures go anywhere from $80 upwards to about $140. I don't think they're incredibly expensive. They are sealed. You can wipe them, you can clean them, and they've got 70,000 hours of lifespan on them before you have to get rid of them, or whatever that equates to. But if you're using old halogens, get rid of those and put in the sealed LEDs. And I think, Amy, that was the last question. I apologize if I was talking really fast there, but I wanted to make sure that I got everybody's questions in. I appreciate your time. If there's anything we didn't discuss, you want to reach out to me, there's my contact information, and I really appreciate everybody joining us today.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Bryan, and thank you everyone for attending today's session. As a reminder, please fill out the evaluation link for CE credit. It's worth 1 contact hour. The deadline for CE credit is October the 14th, and 1 hour following today's session, you will receive an email with the evaluation link, a download to the slides, and also a recording of today's webinar. Thank you so much and have a great afternoon.